It was one of those perfect autumn evenings when the forest seemed to hum with a deep, earthy pulse. The air was crisp with a slight chill, and the fading light of day stretched lazily across the trees. The kind of evening where the sun sets behind the mountains just a little too quickly, making the shadows seem longer, deeper. I had planned this trip for months. Just me, a tent, my gear, and a weekend to myself. No distractions, no people, just a few days of peace. And for a while, that's exactly what it was. I'd driven out to a remote campsite, deep in a national forest, far enough from civilization that I didn't have to worry about noise or anyone disturbing me. It wasn't exactly what most people would call safe camping. No amenities, no clear paths or marked trails, just the deep woods. But that's what I wanted. No distractions, no one telling me to hurry, no one asking me if I wanted to go anywhere or do anything. Just me, my thoughts, and nature. The campsite itself was nestled near a small creek, where the sound of the running water would be my constant companion. I set up my tent on a patch of flat ground, just off the creek's edge. The site was perfect, tucked between towering pines with branches that whispered in the wind. The fire pit was already there, a circle of stones, waiting for a fire. After setting up camp, I boiled some water for coffee and just sat, soaking in the quiet. As night began to fall, I lit the fire. The smell of wood smoke filled the air, and the crackling of the fire was the only sound around me. The forest was alive, but only just. No animals ventured close enough to disturb the peace. At least that's what I thought. I had everything I needed. A few books, a journal, some snacks, and a couple of beers. I settled in, the crackle of the fire mixing with the distant sound of the creek. By the time the sky turned black, the stars began to shine, clearer than I'd ever seen them before. It felt as though the entire universe was stretched out above me, each star a sharp pinprick of light in the night sky. It was beautiful, perfect, and I was happy to be there, alone with my thoughts. But that's when things started to feel off. At first, I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. It was just a strange unease, like something was tugging at the edges of my awareness. The fire crackled, and the wind rustled the trees, but there was this feeling, this strange feeling, that I wasn't alone. I stood up, stretching my legs, and walked around the fire, scanning the trees around me. Nothing. The shadows were deep, but nothing moved. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. It gnawed at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. I tried to shake it off, but the more I tried, the worse it got. It was as if the woods were alive with a presence, something unseen, something watching. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was just the isolation, maybe the sounds of the forest were playing tricks on me, or maybe I was just overthinking things. But the thought kept creeping into my head. There was something out there. I stoked the fire a bit, watching the flames leap higher into the night, casting erratic shadows across the trees. My stomach tightened. I needed to calm down. I told myself that I'd been in the woods many times before. I'd been alone on camping trips countless times, and nothing had ever happened. This was just a normal night. I grabbed my journal and sat back down by the fire, trying to focus on something else. But it didn't help. The unease didn't go away. Every rustle of the leaves, every creak of the trees, every snap of a twig felt amplified, like I was waiting for something to happen, something I couldn't see, something that might be too close. I sat for a while, pretending I didn't hear it, the faint sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just a trick of my mind, my senses heightened by the isolation. But no, it was real. It was unmistakable. The soft crunch of leaves and dirt, deliberate and slow, coming from the woods beyond the firelight. My heart started to race. The footsteps paused. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I held mine too. I told myself it was probably another camper, lost or confused. But even as I thought that, I knew it didn't make sense. This campsite was far from any marked trail. I hadn't seen a single person all day. No one had passed me on the way in. The footsteps started up again, closer now. I stood up, my legs stiff and cold, and grabbed my flashlight from my bag. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I felt the need to be ready to face whatever it was that was out there. I flicked the flashlight on and swung it in the direction of the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the shadows of trees and the thick underbrush. But the sound, it didn't stop. It continued, just on the edge of my hearing, as though whoever or whatever it was trying to be quiet, trying to avoid detection. I stood there for a long moment, straining my ears, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to make sense of it all. The footsteps stopped again, and for a few seconds, everything went deathly silent. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I wanted to leave. But that wasn't an option. Not yet. I had to figure out what was going on. I backed up slowly to the fire, my eyes never leaving the darkness. Every nerve in my body was on edge, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't know what was out there, but I didn't think it was a person. No person would move like that, slow, careful, avoiding being seen. It wasn't natural. The fire crackled, and I could hear the water of the creek bubbling in the distance. But then another sound, closer this time, came to my ears. A low, guttural noise, like the deep breathing of something large. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. Whatever it was something else. I kept the flashlight on, pointing it toward the trees, trying to pierce the shadows. But the beam didn't reach far enough. The sound was getting closer, and then, in the distance, I thought I saw something. A shape, just a blur against the dark forest. It moved, fast and low to the ground, just out of the corner of my eye. Panic started to rise in me. I grabbed my backpack and slung it over my shoulder, not knowing what to do, but feeling a strong urge to leave. I turned to go, but the instant I started to move, the noise stopped. The footsteps, the breathing, everything. It was like the forest itself had gone still, waiting. I stopped, my mind racing, my thoughts tangled. Whatever it wasn't just some lost hiker. It wasn't even an animal. There was something different about it, something I couldn't quite grasp. Then, without warning, the sound came again, this time louder, right behind me. A rush of air, like something large was moving quickly through the brush. My heart skipped a beat as I spun around, flashlight in hand, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. Just a flash. A figure, tall and thin, darting between the trees like it had been hiding there all along. My mind screamed at me to run, but I didn't know where to go. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape. I thought about the car, but the path was too far and the forest was too thick. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to calm down. Running would only make things worse. I had to think, I had to act. The air felt different now, thick, oppressive. The forest felt alive, like it was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving all around me, hiding just out of sight. Whatever it was fast, it was smart, and it was hunting. And then, for a moment, it was quiet again. I stood there, trembling, flashlight clutched tightly in my hand, eyes darting to every shadow. My breathing was loud in my ears. Slowly, carefully, I backed toward the fire, keeping my eyes on the trees, my senses stretched to the limit. And then, finally, a branch cracked loudly, and I whipped around, shining the light in that direction. The beam caught something, someone moving through the underbrush. I could barely make out the figure in the darkness, but it was human. Just a person, walking calmly toward the fire, their face hidden in shadow. My pulse slowed. My heart still raced, but it wasn't the creature I had feared. It was just another camper, a person who had gotten lost and was now heading toward me. As they stepped into the firelight, I saw the relief in their eyes when they saw me. I had been so focused on the fear that I hadn't realized just how relieved I was to see them. "Hey," I said, voice shaky but relieved. I thought there was something out there." The person smiled and shook their head. "Just me." Got turned around in the dark. The tension melted from my shoulders. We exchanged a few words, and after a brief conversation, I realized they were as scared as I had been, confused by the strange sounds in the night. But as it turned out, there was nothing to fear after all. I'd always enjoyed camping. Ever since I was a kid, it felt like the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The simplicity of the woods, the crackling of the campfire, the feeling of being surrounded by nature. It all seemed like the perfect way to unwind and recharge. So when I had a weekend off from work and my friend, Jake, suggested a camping trip, I didn't hesitate to say yes. We decided to head out to a place a few hours north of the city, a secluded area surrounded by thick forest. The trail was known to be quiet, peaceful, and untouched by crowds. Perfect, I thought. Just what we needed. We packed our gear, including a couple of tents, sleeping bags, cooking supplies, and of course, our usual assortment of snacks and drinks. We were prepared for a 2-night stay. Nothing fancy, just the essentials. The drive there was scenic. As we made our way deeper into the countryside, the roads became less populated. The trees seemed to grow taller, denser, casting shadows on the narrow path ahead. It felt like we were heading into the heart of nowhere, but that's exactly what we wanted. We arrived at the trailhead around noon, just as the sun was starting to reach its highest point in the sky. The air was crisp and fresh, the kind of air that makes you feel alive. There were a few other cars parked at the trailhead, but it wasn't crowded. Most people probably just hiked in for a day and went back to their cars. We, however, had a more adventurous plan. We were going to hike deep into the woods and set up camp far from the trail so we wouldn't be bothered. We grabbed our backpacks and started the hike. The trail wasn't too difficult, just a steady incline with occasional rocky patches. It was peaceful, the only sounds being the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. As we walked, we didn't talk much. Both of us were content to let the solitude of the forest take over. After a couple of hours, we found a nice spot near a small stream. It was the perfect place for a campsite. Flat ground, enough space for our tents, and a good water source nearby. We unpacked and started setting up camp. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. By the time we had our tents pitched, it was just about evening. We built a fire, its warm glow cutting through the chill that was beginning to settle in. Jake pulled out the snacks, and we ate in silence for a while. There was something calming about the crackling fire and the quiet of the forest around us. It was just us and the woods, and I felt completely at ease. But as the night crept on, the atmosphere began to shift. I couldn't explain it at first, but I started to feel watched. It was subtle at first, like a faint tingle on the back of my neck. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more pronounced it became. Every time I glanced into the darkness between the trees, I felt like something was lurking just beyond the firelight, waiting. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. After all, the forest was full of wildlife. Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon watching from the shadows. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. Jake seemed oblivious to my growing unease. He was relaxing by the fire, flipping through a magazine, and occasionally making small talk about how nice it was to be away from the noise of the city. I wanted to mention how strange it felt, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. So I just sat there, trying to push the feeling out of my mind. It wasn't long before the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, making the branches creak and groan. The fire flickered, casting eerie, dancing shadows all around us. The sound of the wind was almost unnerving, like the forest itself was alive and whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. Jake stood up to tend to the fire, and for a brief moment, I was alone. I stared into the flames, trying to focus on something tangible, something that made sense. That's when I heard it, a snap. It was quiet at first, almost like a twig breaking, but it was sharp enough to make my heart skip a beat. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The wind had died down for a moment, leaving only the soft murmur of the stream and the rustling of leaves. But that sound, it hadn't come from the wind. My eyes darted around, scanning the edges of the camp. The trees were thick, and the darkness beyond the firelight seemed to swallow everything up. I couldn't see anything, but the sensation of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I tried to rationalize it. It was just a small animal, probably a squirrel or something. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Another snap, followed by the softest rustle, like something or someone moving through the underbrush. I wasn't sure if I should say something to Jake. I didn't want to freak him out, but at the same time, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I looked over at him, but he was still busy adjusting the fire, unaware of the tension creeping through me. The feeling grew, pushing me toward a sense of dread. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The fire crackled as I walked a little closer to the edge of the camp, peering into the dark. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the trees, a faint shadow moved. It was too large to be an animal. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it, still and silent. It didn't move like an animal would. There was no rustling of leaves, no breaking of branches. It just stood there. I was frozen, unsure of what to do. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was another hiker? But no one had passed by on the trail since we got there. It was too dark for anyone to be out here without a flashlight, and there was no sound of footsteps or voices. The shadow shifted slightly, and my blood ran cold. It was real. It was someone or something watching us from just outside the light. I grabbed a nearby stick and threw it into the darkness, hoping to scare whatever it was away. The moment it left my hand, the shadow disappeared, vanishing into the blackness of the forest. I stood there, staring, waiting for any sign that it would come back. Didn't. Jake looked up, startled by the sound of the stick hitting the ground. He seemed confused. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded, though my throat felt dry. "Yeah, just thought I saw something." He shrugged, turning back to the fire. "Probably just a raccoon or something. You know how these places are." I didn't reply. I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't a raccoon. We stayed by the fire for a while longer, and as the hours passed, the forest seemed to quiet down. The feeling of being watched faded, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there, lurking just beyond the safety of the firelight. Eventually, we went to bed, each of us retreating to our tents. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, it was a peaceful place. People came here all the time. There was nothing to be afraid of, but the shadows outside my tent seemed to move. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was out there. The feeling of unease wouldn't let me rest. I lay there wide awake, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but I woke up the next morning to the sound of birds singing in the trees. The sun had just begun to rise, and the forest was bathed in a soft, golden light. The air was cool and everything felt normal again, almost too normal. Jake was already up, making breakfast over the fire. I got up and joined him, though my mind was still on the events of the previous night. The feeling of being watched had never truly left me, even after I had gotten some sleep. "Good sleep?" Jake asked, looking up at me with a grin. "Yeah, good," I lied, not wanting to sound ridiculous. We ate our breakfast in silence, the peacefulness of the morning almost mocking the unease that had clung to me all night. As we packed up to head back to the trail, I took one last look around the campsite. The trees stood tall and still, and the morning light filtered through the leaves. The place felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching us. Something had been waiting. I didn't tell Jake. Couldn't. What would I have said? I couldn't explain it myself. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't some mythical creature. It was just a presence, something human yet not. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. I didn't know what had been out there that night, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to find out. And to this day, I still wonder if there's someone or something out there in those woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers to cross its path. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and the wild. The kind of weekend where I could forget about my phone, disconnect from the pressures of work, and find some space for my mind to clear. I had decided to head out to a campsite about 2 hours from the nearest town. It wasn't a popular spot, the kind of place where people who love solitude go to avoid the noise of everyday life. The trail wasn't marked well, and the spot didn't have the usual amenities that other campsites offered. It was primitive, just the way I liked it. I arrived around mid-afternoon, the air crisp but warm enough to feel comfortable in just a light jacket. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I grabbed my pack, which held the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, and a small camping stove. Nothing fancy. I wasn't going to be out here long, just a weekend, but I liked being prepared. The trailhead wasn't much to look at. A barely noticeable clearing in the thick forest, where the trees grew so close together you could hardly see more than a few feet in front of you. I paused for a moment before stepping into the woods, feeling the weight of the silence around me. The wind barely stirred the leaves, and there were no sounds of animals, no birds, no squirrels, not even the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. It was just quiet. A little too quiet, I thought at first, but it was probably just the time of day, the light starting to fade, the animals retreating to their dens. I checked my watch. 4:30 p.m. Plenty of daylight left, but I wanted to find a good spot to set up camp before it got dark. The trail, though overgrown and uneven, was easy enough to follow. A few small streams trickled nearby, and every now and then I spotted an animal track in the soft earth. Deer, maybe, or foxes. About an hour into the hike, I came across a small clearing. It seemed like a perfect place to pitch my tent. Flat ground, sheltered from the wind by thick trees on all sides, with a view of the distant hills. The setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, and I felt a sense of peace as I unloaded my gear. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and cooked a simple dinner of dehydrated noodles. As I sat on a rock by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more of a discomfort, like I was being watched. I kept glancing around the edge of the clearing, half expecting to see someone standing just outside the reach of the firelight. But there was no one. The only movement was the crackling of the fire and the occasional swaying of tree branches in the breeze. I shrugged it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. The wilderness could make you feel isolated, like you were the only person in the world. Maybe that's what was getting to me. I ate the rest of my meal, cleaned up, and sat by the fire for a while, letting the warmth chase away the chill that was starting to settle in the air. The darkness crept in quickly, and soon enough, I had the fire to myself. I knew I should go to bed soon, but I wasn't tired. The night felt thick, oppressive almost. The kind of night where your own breathing seems too loud in the quiet, and you can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. I glanced at my watch again. 8:30 p.m. Still plenty of time before I had to sleep, but I felt unsettled. I stood up to stretch my legs and walked around the perimeter of the clearing, looking for anything that might explain the strange feeling I had. Maybe I was just spooked by the silence, I thought. No other campers had passed by, no hikers, no one. The trail seemed forgotten. I moved to the edge of the trees, where the darkness was almost total. The firelight barely reached that far, and the shadows swallowed the trees whole. I paused, straining my ears for any sound, and then I heard it, a rustling. At first, it was so soft I thought it might be a breeze shifting the underbrush, but the sound grew louder, closer, like something or someone was moving through the woods. The rustling wasn't random either. It was deliberate, controlled, the way you might step carefully through the undergrowth to avoid snapping a twig. But the pattern was wrong, uneven, like whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I could feel my heart rate picking up. Was someone out there? A hiker? Maybe who had gotten lost or was trying to sneak up on me? My mind raced. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the dark tree line, but I couldn't see anything beyond the faint outline of the trunks and branches. The rustling stopped. Complete silence followed, as if the forest had held its breath. I waited for what felt like an eternity, holding my flashlight tight in my hand, shining it nervously around the trees. Then, just as I was about to turn back to my camp, the sound came again. Closer this time, louder, like someone was walking straight toward me. My mind raced with possibilities. Person? An animal? But why was it so deliberate? So cautious? I backed slowly toward the fire, trying not to make any noise, my eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the clearing. I reached the edge of the campfire's light and stopped. My breath came in shallow bursts as I scanned the trees, waiting for something, anything, to give me a sign. The rustling stopped again, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't want to be a fool and panic, but something about that silence was wrong. Felt too still, almost too quiet, like the woods were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I spent the rest of the evening by the fire, my back to the tent, my flashlight in hand. My eyes darted from the shadows to the flickering flames, never quite trusting the darkness. I kept expecting something to emerge from the trees, but nothing did. Eventually, the fire began to die down, and I forced myself to turn in. The tent felt small, like a little bubble of safety in the vast, oppressive wilderness outside. I zipped myself in, double-checked that everything was secure, and pulled the sleeping bag around me. But I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of the leaves, every distant snap of a twig had me wide awake, listening. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a start, the sound of something heavy crashing through the woods breaking through my half-sleep. My heart pounded as I listened, straining to hear through the thick fabric of the tent. There were no voices, no shuffling of feet, no human sounds. Just something large moving through the woods, brushing against the trees and undergrowth. It moved in a strange, unpredictable pattern, like it wasn't aware of its surroundings, or like it was deliberately avoiding them. I tried to tell myself it was just a bear. Bears didn't like to get close to humans, so they usually kept their distance, right? But this felt different. The movement was deliberate, as if someone was circling the camp. I lay there, frozen, until the sound finally stopped. For the rest of the night, I lay wide awake, holding my breath, barely daring to move, waiting for the morning. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but relieved. The woods felt less oppressive in the early light. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, squinting at the sun. There was no sign of anyone, no animal tracks, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. It was just a normal morning in the woods. I packed up my camp quickly, my hands trembling more than I wanted to admit. The strange feeling still clung to me, but I couldn't explain it. I was ready to go. I didn't want to stay another minute. As I made my way back to the trailhead, the feeling of being watched slowly faded, and I found myself wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me. Maybe I had just spooked myself. But as I reached the spot where I'd parked my car, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, just outside the parking lot, was a single, fresh footprint in the dirt. It was large, too large to be human, and the edges of it were crisp, as if it had only been made moments ago. The ground around it was undisturbed, and there was no sign of anyone else. No cars, no people. Just the one footprint, the kind of print that could only belong to something that was very real and very large. I didn't stay long enough to investigate. I hopped into my car and drove away, not looking back. I don't know what I heard that night or what made that footprint, but I do know one thing for sure. I'm never camping there again. I never should have gone back. That thought kept running through my head as I stood outside my truck, staring at the thick line of trees in front of me. The trailhead was overgrown, just like I remembered it, and the same uneasy feeling settled into my chest like it had years ago. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I had promised myself I wouldn't return to this place, but life has a way of making you do things you swore you never would. My brother, Aaron, had gone missing here 6 months ago. No trace of him had ever been found, not even a piece of his gear. He'd come out alone for a weekend camping trip, just like we used to as kids, but he never came back. After the initial search efforts died down, the authorities chalked it up to an accident. Maybe he fell, got lost, or ran into a bear. But I knew my brother. He wasn't careless, and he sure as hell wasn't the kind of guy to just disappear without a trace. So I was back. I adjusted the straps on my pack and locked the truck, taking a deep breath before stepping onto the trail. The path wound through dense forest, the sunlight barely filtering through the thick canopy above. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, just the occasional groan of tree branches shifting in the wind. It felt wrong, the way it had all those years ago. The first time Aaron and I had camped out here, we were just teenagers. We had spent the day hiking, setting up camp near the lake before nightfall. I remember how the air felt still that evening, how the woods seemed to close in around us the moment the sun dipped behind the mountains. Aaron had joked about it, calling it prime horror movie territory. But even back then, I could tell he felt it too. That strange, suffocating unease that made the shadows seem deeper than they should be. That night, something had woken me up. A sound, low, steady, rhythmic, like footsteps, but wrong. Too deliberate, too slow. I had sat up in my sleeping bag, heart hammering, straining my ears in the darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the outline of our tent and the surrounding trees. Nothing else. But the sound had continued, growing fainter, like whatever had been out there was moving away. I had woken Aaron up, whispering that something was outside, but by then, the noise was gone. We had convinced ourselves it was nothing. A deer? Maybe? Or just our imaginations playing tricks on us. But I never forgot that feeling. The way the air had felt heavy, the way my skin had crawled with something I couldn't explain. Now, standing in that same forest years later, the memory felt sharper than ever. I pushed forward, following the trail as it wound deeper into the woods. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and damp leaves that softened my footsteps. I was looking for any sign of my brother, his campsite, his gear, anything that might tell me what had happened to him. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was starting to dip below the tree line. The water was still, reflecting the deep orange of the sky. I set my pack down and took a moment to catch my breath, scanning the shoreline for anything unusual. Nothing. I found a good spot to set up camp, clearing away debris before pitching my tent. As I worked, that old feeling of unease settled in again. The woods were too quiet. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my memories get the best of me. But deep down, I knew better. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. My body tensed as I strained to listen. They were closer this time, moving just beyond the reach of my tent. I reached for the knife in my pack, gripping the handle so tight my knuckles ached. The footsteps paused, then shifted direction, circling my campsite. My mind raced. A person? An animal? Something else? I forced myself to breathe, waiting, listening. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The woods fell silent again, that thick, suffocating quiet pressing in around me. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed up my gear and moved quickly, following the lake's edge in search of anything that might tell me my brother had been here. The air was thick with morning mist, curling around the trees and making it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. I kept moving, scanning the ground for anything, footprints, a piece of fabric, anything. Then I saw it, a boot, half buried in the mud near the water's edge. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, reaching down to pull it free. It was old, weathered, but I recognized it instantly. It was Aaron's. I turned, scanning the area around me, my mind racing. If this was here, then he had been here. He had made it to the lake, but where had he gone after that? The woods remained silent, too silent. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I had come here for answers, and I wasn't leaving without them. But as I stood there, gripping that boot, one thought ran through my mind over and over again. I never should have come back. I don't know why I agreed to this trip. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I just wanted to get away for a while. Either way, I was here now, alone in the middle of nowhere with nothing but the sounds of the woods around me. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. I wanted solitude, time to clear my head, and maybe even a little bit of a challenge. I wasn't new to camping, but I wasn't exactly an expert either. I figured one night alone in the woods would be fine. Just me, my tent, my gear, and the silence. I picked a spot far from any campground. I didn't want to be near other people. I wanted to test myself, to see if I could handle being alone in the wild. I found a clearing near a small creek, a good place to set up my tent. The sun was already starting to set by the time I finished setting up. I gathered some firewood and built a small fire. The warmth felt good against the cool evening air. As I sat there, eating a simple meal, I listened to the sounds of the forest. The rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful in a way, but also unsettling. There's something about being alone in the woods that makes you hyper-aware of every little noise, every crack of a branch, every gust of wind. After a while, I decided to turn in for the night. I put out the fire, double-checked my tent, and crawled inside. I left a small flashlight next to me, just in case. As I lay there, staring at the tent's fabric above me, I felt a strange unease settle in my chest. It was too quiet now. The sounds of the forest seemed distant, muted. I told myself I was just overthinking things. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was still dark, but something had startled me. I listened, holding my breath. At first, I heard nothing, just the wind. But then, there it was. A sound. Footsteps? They were slow, deliberate. Not the scurrying of a small animal, but heavier. Human? I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. The tent glowed dimly from the light, but I couldn't see anything outside. The footsteps had stopped. I sat there, frozen, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I had dreamt it. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, trying to calm myself. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I held my breath. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. Slow, careful, like someone trying to move without being heard. Panic crept up my spine. I wanted to move, to look outside, but fear kept me frozen in place. My mind raced. Who else would be out here? There were no campgrounds nearby, no trails. I had hiked miles to get here. I was alone. I was supposed to be alone. I sat there, gripping my flashlight, listening. Then, as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. The silence pressed down on me. I strained my ears, waiting for another sound. But there was nothing, just the wind in the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn touched the sky, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. My breath hung in the cool morning air as I looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. No footprints. No signs that anyone had been here. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my mind had twisted the sounds of the forest into something sinister. I tried to shake it off as I packed up my camp. I was tired, but I didn't want to stay another night. Something felt wrong about this place now. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't want to be here anymore. As I hiked back toward my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. The unease from the night before hadn't left me. When I finally reached my car, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I loaded up my gear as quickly as I could and got inside, locking the doors. I started the engine and pulled out onto the narrow dirt road, eager to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. As I drove, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. I told myself it had all been in my head, just paranoia, just the isolation getting to me. But then I saw something in my rearview mirror, a figure, standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible between the trunks. Watching me, I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just kept driving, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I didn't look back again. I don't know who or what I saw that morning, but I do know one thing. I won't be going back. I didn't want to go camping that weekend, but my friends had already planned everything. They were excited, and I didn't want to be the one to kill the mood. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just 2 nights in a remote part of the woods, a few miles away from the main trails. No cell service, no nearby towns, just nature. The drive was long, about 4 hours of winding roads, followed by a long stretch of dirt paths that our cars barely managed. We parked at the base of a small hill, unloaded our gear, and hiked about a mile into the woods. The spot we picked was perfect, flat land surrounded by trees, with a small clearing where we could build a fire. There was a stream nearby, just far enough that we couldn't hear the water, but close enough for us to get fresh water if needed. The first night was fine. We set up our tents, gathered wood, and started a fire. We drank, laughed, and told stupid stories. The usual camping stuff. The forest was eerily quiet at night, but that was expected in a place like this. No cars, no people, just the wind through the trees and the occasional sound of a branch snapping in the distance. I woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. Crawling out of my tent, I grabbed my flashlight and walked a few steps into the trees. The cold air hit me, and I shivered. The night was silent, too silent. Not even the sound of bugs or the wind, just silence. I did my business quickly and turned back. That's when I noticed something. Our campfire was out, which was normal, but something was off. The ground near the fire looked disturbed, as if someone had walked around in circles. I figured one of my friends must have woken up and wandered around, maybe checking the fire. But as I got closer, I saw footprints leading away from the fire, not in the direction of our tents, but deeper into the woods. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the cold air. The prints were fresh. They didn't belong to any of us. We had all been in our tents, zipped up for the night. I shined my flashlight towards the trees, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Just the tall, thick trunks of trees and the endless blackness beyond them. I didn't wake anyone up. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had passed through, though I knew that didn't make sense. I climbed back into my tent and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I didn't mention what I saw. We cooked breakfast over the fire and spent the day exploring. The woods were thick, but there were small trails here and there, likely made by deer. At one point, we found an old, rusted-out truck deep in the woods, its doors missing, vines growing through the windows. It had been there for decades. We joked about how someone must have abandoned it after something terrible happened, but it was just a joke. Or at least, that's what I told myself. That night, things got worse. I woke up again around 2 a.m. This time, I wasn't the only one awake. I could hear movement outside, light footsteps on the dirt. At first, I thought it was one of my friends, but the steps were too slow, too careful, like someone was trying not to be heard. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps moved around our camp, stopping near our tents. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. I didn't want to move. I didn't even want to breathe. Then, my tent zipper started to move. I panicked. I kicked out hard, hitting the zipper area. There was a sudden rustling, and the footsteps rushed away, disappearing into the trees. I sat there, frozen, waiting to hear more, but everything was silent again. After a long time, I unzipped my tent and peeked out. Nothing. The fire was still burning low, casting shadows across the trees. I could see my friends' tents, untouched. Everything looked normal, but I knew it wasn't. I stayed up until the sun came up, listening to every tiny sound. When the others woke, I told them what happened. They laughed at first, but when I showed them the footprints circling our camp, their expressions changed. We packed up fast. No one argued about cutting the trip short. As we hiked back to our cars, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something watching us, but we never saw anything. We made it home safely, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone that night, that someone had been out there, watching, waiting. Maybe they had been there the first night, too. Maybe they had been there even before we arrived. I haven't been camping since. I don't go camping anymore. I used to love it. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of being disconnected from the noise of the world. But after what happened that night, I don't think I'll ever sleep outside again. It started as a simple trip. I had some time off work, and I wanted to get away. No responsibilities, no deadlines, just me, my gear, and the woods. I picked a remote area in the national forest, somewhere I had never been before. It was a good few miles off the main roads, a place where no one would bother me. I packed my bag, loaded up my truck, and set off early in the morning. The drive was peaceful. I watched as the city slowly gave way to rolling hills, then to dense forest. The farther I went, the more isolated I felt, but I liked that. I turned onto a dirt road, following my GPS to the spot I had marked. The road was rough, filled with deep potholes and scattered branches. It was clear that not many people came this way. Eventually, I reached the clearing. It was perfect, a flat area surrounded by towering trees, with just enough space to set up camp. There was no sign of other people, no tire tracks, no trash, nothing. I felt like I had the whole forest to myself. I got to work setting up my tent, gathering wood for a fire, and making myself comfortable. As the afternoon passed, I walked around a bit, exploring the area. The forest was thick, the trees standing like silent watchers. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant call of birds. As evening fell, I made a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows across the trees. I sat there for a while, just enjoying the solitude. There was something peaceful about being so far from everything, away from the constant noise of life. But as the sun dipped below the trees, a strange feeling crept over me. It wasn't fear exactly, but an odd unease, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was alone. There was no one out here. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The trees seemed darker, the silence heavier. I forced myself to ignore it and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. I lay there in the dark, listening. The fire outside had died down, leaving only faint embers glowing in the night. Then I heard it, a sound, faint at first but unmistakable. Footsteps, not the random rustling of an animal, but slow, deliberate steps. Something or someone was out there. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. Silence. My heart pounded in my chest. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was some animal moving through the trees. Then the footsteps started again. Closer this time. I felt frozen. I wanted to grab my flashlight, to unzip the tent and look outside, but I couldn't make myself move. Every instinct in me screamed to stay quiet, to stay still. The footsteps stopped again, just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow, heavy. I swallowed hard, gripping the knife I had brought with me. I didn't dare move. The fabric of the tent was thin, barely a barrier between me and whatever was standing there. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the breathing stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading into the darkness. I lay there, heart hammering in my chest, waiting, listening. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't move. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and despite my fear, I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was rising. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body tense. I listened. Nothing, just the usual morning sounds of the forest. I unzipped the tent carefully and stepped outside. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before. Nothing seemed out of place. But then I saw them. Footprints, large ones, human ones, leading from the edge of the trees to my tent and then back into the woods. I felt sick. My mind raced. Someone had been out here, walking around my campsite while I slept, watching me. I didn't waste time. I packed up as quickly as I could, stuffing everything into my bag with shaking hands. The entire time, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. When I finally got in my truck and started the engine, I felt a wave of relief. But as I drove back down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I never found out who it was. I don't want to know. All I know is that I was not alone that night, and I never will be again. I drove deep into the woods, past where most people would turn back. The road had narrowed to almost nothing, just 2 dirt tracks cut through the trees. Branches scraped against the sides of my truck, their bare fingers leaving streaks in the dust. The late afternoon sun sat low behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had picked this place carefully. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I had found on a map, deep enough into the woods that I wouldn't run into anyone. I wanted that. No other campers, no noise, just the quiet hum of the forest. The truck jolted as I pulled onto a small clearing. A fire pit sat in the middle, surrounded by old, moss-covered stones. Someone had been here before, but not recently. I killed the engine, and for a moment, I just sat there, listening. The forest had a sound to it, not total silence, but a soft background of rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional creak of branches shifting in the wind. I got out, stretched my legs, and started setting up camp. The tent went up quickly. I'd done this plenty of times before. My gear was basic but reliable: tent, sleeping bag, some food, a flashlight, and a hunting knife. I wasn't worried about animals. The biggest thing out here was probably a black bear, and they usually avoided people. By the time the fire was crackling, the sun had dipped below the trees. The light faded fast in the forest, and soon, it was just the glow of the fire against the darkness. I cooked some canned soup over the flames and ate it straight from the pot. The air was crisp, colder than I had expected for this time of year. I pulled my jacket tighter around me. That's when I noticed it, the shift in the sounds of the forest. The normal noises had faded, replaced by something else. A stillness. At first, I thought maybe a predator was nearby. That would make sense. Animals go quiet when something dangerous is around. I reached for my knife just to have it close. Then I heard the crunch. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees just beyond the firelight. I turned my head quickly, scanning the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows. The sound had stopped. I held my breath, listening. The fire crackled, sending a spray of sparks into the air. Then another step, closer this time. I stood up, gripping the knife tight in my hand. "Hello!" My voice felt small in the vastness of the forest. No answer. I moved toward the truck, trying to act natural. My keys were in the tent, but I didn't want to turn my back to get them. The fire was my only source of light, and beyond it, everything was just blackness. Another step, then another. Closer now. I wasn't alone. My mind raced. A bear would have made more noise. A cougar wouldn't be walking around like that. This was a person. I took a step back toward the fire. The light should have given me a better view, but it felt like it only made the shadows deeper. The feeling in my gut was wrong. Not just fear, but something worse. Then I saw it. Just beyond the reach of the firelight, a figure stood between the trees. Not moving, not making a sound, just standing there watching me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a body, tall, thin. I gripped the knife tighter. "Who's there?" No answer. A long moment passed. Then the figure stepped back into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. I listened for footsteps but heard nothing. My mind screamed at me to get in the truck and leave, but my keys were still in the tent. I had to get them. I forced myself to move, slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line. I reached the tent, unzipped it with one hand, and grabbed the keys. When I turned back, the fire flickered, sending a wave of shadows through the trees. The figure was closer now, not moving, just watching. I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the truck, yanked the door open, and jumped inside. The second I slammed the door shut, I locked it. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I flipped on the headlights. Nothing. The forest in front of me was empty. For a long moment, I sat there, my breath coming in fast, uneven gasps. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just shadows playing tricks on me. Then, behind me, a soft thud, the sound of a hand pressing against the back window. I didn't look. I threw the truck into drive and slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and I tore out of the clearing, branches whipping against the sides. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road, miles away. I didn't camp alone after that. Whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't some harmless hiker. It was watching, waiting, and I wasn't about to give it another chance. I always enjoyed camping. I grew up doing it with my dad, and it became something I carried into adulthood. There was something about being out in the quiet, away from everything, that made me feel at peace. That's why, when I finally had a weekend off, I packed my gear, filled the cooler, and headed for a remote camping spot I had read about online. It was deep in the woods, miles from any town. The kind of place where you wouldn't see another soul for days. That's exactly what I wanted. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. The drive out there was long. I turned off the main road onto a dirt path that twisted through the forest. My truck bounced over potholes and loose gravel. I hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes, and that was just how I liked it. I wanted to be alone. I reached the site in the late afternoon. It was a clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a narrow stream nearby. The water was slow-moving and clear, perfect for filtering and drinking. I stepped out of the truck and took a deep breath. The air was fresh, tinged with pine and damp earth. I set up camp quickly. Tent staked down, firewood gathered, cooler in the shade. I always kept my supplies organized, a habit drilled into me from years of camping with my dad. A clean camp is a safe camp. No food left out, no trash lying around. Out here, you didn't want to attract animals. As the sun dropped, I got a small fire going and cooked a simple meal. Just beans and some jerky washed down with a cold beer. The night settled in around me, the forest becoming a wall of darkness. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I sat by the fire for a long time, just enjoying the quiet. My phone had no signal, but I didn't mind. That was the point, after all. No emails, no news, no distractions. Just me and the night. Around midnight, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. The temperature had dropped, and the sleeping bag felt warm and comforting. I laid there for a while, listening. The forest was never truly silent. Crickets, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the distant sound of the stream. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake. Something had snapped a branch outside. I stayed still, my ears straining. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, maybe even the wind knocking something loose. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the quick, darting movements of an animal. These were heavier, human. My stomach clenched. No one should be out here. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make a sound. The zipper of the tent was halfway down, leaving a small opening. I turned the light on and aimed it through the gap. Nothing. I waited, barely breathing. The fire pit was cold and dark. The trees beyond it just shadows against deeper blackness. I flicked the light around, but all I saw was my camp, undisturbed. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I had been alone all day after all. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, but sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound made my nerves spike. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid, but I kept the flashlight in my hand, just in case. The night passed slowly. I must have slept at some point because I woke to sunlight filtering through the tent fabric. The uneasy feeling from the night before was still there, but I shook it off. I stepped outside and stretched, scanning the campsite. Everything looked the same. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. Maybe I had dreamed it. I decided to do some hiking to clear my head. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and headed into the trees. The trail wasn't well marked, but I had a compass and a map. I had always been good with directions. The hike was peaceful at first. Birds flitted between branches, squirrels chattered. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. After about an hour, I found an old fire ring. Someone had camped here before. The ashes were damp, meaning it had been at least a few days. That's when I noticed something. The fire ring was still intact, but the logs around it were smashed, as if someone had taken a rock to them. Nearby, I saw a shredded sleeping bag. It was ripped open, stuffing spilling out. I frowned. A bear, maybe, but there were no claw marks, no signs of an animal dragging anything away. It looked deliberate. A bad feeling settled in my gut. I turned back toward camp. I walked faster than before, glancing over my shoulder more than once. The woods felt different now, less welcoming. When I reached camp, I felt a wave of relief until I noticed something. The cooler. It was open. I knew I had closed it. I always did. But now the lid was up and my food was scattered. The strange part? Nothing was taken. Not the jerky, not the granola bars. Just moved. I checked my truck. The doors were locked, just as I had left them. But I still felt like I wasn't alone. I sat by the fire pit, gripping my knife. The sun was starting to go down. Leaving now would mean driving those winding dirt roads in the dark, and I wasn't sure that was any safer. I decided to stay, but I kept the fire burning bright. Every so often, I swept my flashlight over the trees, expecting to see something. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I held my breath. The fire crackled, casting shadows. Then, just beyond the tree line, I saw it. A figure, standing there, watching me. I grabbed my knife, my flashlight shaking as I pointed it toward them. They didn't move. I couldn't see their face, just a shape in the dark. Then, slowly, they stepped back into the trees and vanished. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, jumped in the truck, and started it up. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and I tore out of there, my heart pounding. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I never found out who it was. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm camping, I still wake up in the middle of the night, listening, wondering if I'm truly alone out there, or if someone is watching. I had always loved being outdoors. Something about the quiet of the woods, the sound of the wind moving through the trees, and the feeling of being cut off from the chaos of the world always felt right to me. I had camped dozens of times before, alone, with friends, with family, but nothing had ever shaken me like this. It started like any other trip. I picked a remote site deep in the woods, away from the crowded campgrounds where people dragged in their portable grills and Bluetooth speakers. I wanted solitude. I wanted to feel like I was really out there. I had done my research and picked a place about 30 miles from town. A friend had mentioned it to me once. Said it was a quiet, beautiful place with a small stream running nearby. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing deep in the woods that backpackers used from time to time. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive out was uneventful. I stopped at a gas station, topped off my tank, and grabbed a couple of extra snacks for the road. The sky was clear, the sun bright, and everything felt normal. The last stretch of the trip was a narrow dirt road that snaked through the trees, rough enough that I had to take it slow. The farther I got, the less I saw of civilization. No houses, no signs, not even a fence. Just trees and silence. I parked at a small pull-off and got my gear together. I was carrying everything in: a tent, a sleeping bag, food, water, and a small hatchet in case I needed to chop firewood. I had a GPS and a compass, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I locked my car, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The hike in was harder than I expected. The trail was overgrown, more of a game path than a hiking trail. Thick brush scraped against my legs, and every step seemed to stir up a cloud of insects. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. At first, it was peaceful, but after a while, I noticed something. There were no birds, No rustling from squirrels or anything like that. Just my footsteps and the occasional creak of tree branches swaying. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. The clearing was just like my friend described. A flat patch of ground surrounded by tall trees, with a small stream running along the edge. It looked perfect. I set my pack down and started setting up my tent. As I worked, I kept noticing how quiet it was. No wind, no animals. Even the stream, though I could see it moving, barely made a sound. Once my camp was set up, I decided to explore a bit. I followed the stream for a while, checking out the area. About half a mile from my site, I found something that made me stop. It was an old fire ring, just a circle of stones blackened by old ashes. Nothing weird about that. People camp out here after all. But there was something off. The ashes looked fresh, like someone had used the spot recently. I crouched down and sifted through them with a stick. The wood wasn't fully burned. There were chunks of it, still solid, as if the fire had been put out in a hurry. I stood up, suddenly uneasy. If someone had been here recently, where were they now? I had been walking for a while, and I hadn't seen any sign of another camper. No gear, no sounds. No footprints other than my own. I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe they had just packed up and left early. Maybe they had moved on to a different spot. I turned around and started back toward my camp. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, just behind me. Not the sound of wind through leaves, but something else. Something moving. I spun around, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just thick forest, shadows stretching long in the fading sunlight. I listened, holding my breath. The silence had weight to it now. My skin crawled. Then it came again. Closer. I didn't see anything, but I knew something was there. I turned and walked quickly back to camp, forcing myself not to run. Running would mean panic, and I wasn't ready for that. I made it back to camp and grabbed my hatchet. I wasn't expecting to need it for anything other than chopping wood, but now it felt necessary. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees, waiting. Nothing happened. The forest stayed silent. I made a fire, hoping it would make me feel safer. The light flickered against the trees, casting shadows that moved whenever the flames shifted. I sat with my back to my tent, watching the darkness, listening. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers. My breath felt too loud in the silence. Then I heard it again. A footstep, not an animal, not the sound of a branch falling. A real footstep, pressing down into the forest floor. Slow, careful. I stayed still, gripping my hatchet so tightly my hand ached. My tent was zipped shut, but I could hear whatever it was moving outside, circling. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I couldn't stay in the tent. If someone or something was out there, I was trapped. I took a slow, shaking breath and moved as quietly as I could, unzipping the tent just an inch. The fire's glow was just enough to see the clearing, and I saw them, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees, not moving, just standing, watching. They were tall, but their face was in shadow. I couldn't see details, only the outline of a person, standing too still, like they were waiting for something. I didn't move. My mind raced. I had no weapon but the hatchet. No way to call for help. My car was a long hike away. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the figure took a step back. And another. Slowly, they faded into the darkness of the trees. I didn't sleep. I stayed in the tent, gripping the hatchet, jumping at every sound. The first light, I packed up and left. I didn't eat, didn't take my time. I just grabbed my things and got out. The whole way back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't know if they were watching me before I even set up camp. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I always liked camping alone. Something about the quiet, the isolation, The feeling of being surrounded by nothing but trees and open sky, it always put me at ease. It was my way of resetting, getting away from the noise of everyday life. This time, I picked a spot deep in a national forest. I won't name which one because I don't want anyone else going there. I had to hike in about 5 miles from where I parked my truck, and by the time I reached my campsite, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. The place was perfect. A small clearing with a fire pit left behind by other campers, a thick wall of trees on 3 sides, and a little stream a few hundred feet away. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a fire going. As I cooked my dinner, just a simple can of chili heated over the flames, I took in the surroundings. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I told myself it was just the time of year. Late summer, early fall, maybe the animals were just less active. But something about the stillness felt wrong. I shook it off and finished my food. As night settled in, the fire became my only source of light. I always loved watching the flames dance, listening to the wood crackle. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, peering into the dark trees, but I saw nothing. No movement, no strange shapes, just the forest standing silent and still. I told myself I was being paranoid. That's what happens when you're alone in the woods. Your mind plays tricks on you. I let the fire die down and crawled into my tent. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up. I wasn't sure what had startled me at first. Then I heard it, a sound, faint but distinct, a rustling in the leaves, slow and deliberate. Not the kind of noise the wind makes, not the random scurrying of a small animal. This was different, steady, unhurried. I held my breath, listening. It stopped. Silence. I stayed still, straining my ears. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound started again, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it at the tent wall. The fabric glowed, but I couldn't see anything outside, just shadows. The sound stopped again. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't imagining it. Something or someone was out there. I debated what to do. Should I call out? Announce my presence? No. If it was an animal, it wouldn't care. If it was a person, I didn't want to let them know I was awake. Instead, I stayed still and listened. Minutes passed. Nothing. The forest was quiet again. After a long while, I convinced myself it was nothing and somehow managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The ground was covered in leaves, so any tracks would have been hard to spot. But I checked anyway. I didn't see any footprints. No signs of an animal. Maybe I really had imagined it. I shook off the uneasy feeling and went about my day. I explored, took some photos, enjoyed the fresh air. But that night, it happened again. This time, it was worse. I woke up to the sound of something moving just outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching the dry leaves underfoot. Then breathing. Not heavy, not labored. Just slow, steady breathing. I stayed frozen, gripping my flashlight, my mind racing. If it was an animal, it wouldn't be standing still like that. If it was a person, why weren't they saying anything? Why weren't they doing anything? I gathered my courage and whispered, "Hello!" The breathing stopped. Silence. I swallowed hard and turned on my flashlight, unzipping the tent just enough to shine the light outside. Nothing. The forest was empty. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was out there. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every sound made me jump. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things. I wasn't taking any chances. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I noticed something. On the ground, just outside my tent, was a single footprint. A boot print. I hadn't seen it the day before, and it wasn't mine. I grabbed my gear and left. I didn't run, but I walked fast, constantly checking over my shoulder. I didn't feel safe until I was back at my truck. I never went back to that spot. I never told anyone where it was. I don't know who or what was out there with me, but I know I wasn't alone. And I know without a doubt that whoever it was, they were watching me. I don't know why I agreed to this trip. Maybe it was the way my brother, Jake, pitched it like some grand adventure. Just 3 nights, he said. A break from everything. No distractions. At the time, it sounded nice. Getting away from work, away from the noise of the city, away from life. But as I sat in my truck, watching the sun sink lower behind the thick trees of the national forest, I regretted it. We had picked a remote spot, a few miles from any official campground, deep in the woods. It wasn't totally off limits, but it was far enough from designated sites that we wouldn't see another soul. That was part of the appeal, I guess. A real, raw camping experience. The drive-in was rough. My tires kicked up dirt and rocks as we bounced down the narrow, winding road. The trees closed in on both sides, thick and unwelcoming. I kept thinking about how, if something happened, there was no easy way out. No cell service, no nearby roads, no people. Just trees, dirt, and silence. By the time I pulled up to the clearing where Jake was waiting, the air had turned cold. He had gotten there a couple of hours earlier to set up. Our tents were up, a fire pit was built, and his beat-up cooler sat next to a log, filled with beer and whatever else he had managed to throw in at the last minute. Typical Jake, never fully prepared, but confident things would work out. The first night was fine. The fire crackled, keeping the darkness at bay. We ate some overcooked hot dogs and sat in silence, drinking, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Every now and then, an owl called or leaves rustled, but it wasn't unsettling. Not yet. We turned in around midnight. I crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling the exhaustion of the day settle in. The quiet was heavy, the kind that pressed in on you. I don't know what time I woke up, but it was still dark. My heart was pounding, though I didn't know why. I lay still, listening. The forest was too quiet now. No wind, no animals, just thick silence. And then crunch. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Human. I held my breath. The steps moved near my tent, then stopped. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was Jake, maybe up for a piss. But why would he be standing still? Why wasn't he moving? Minutes passed. Nothing. Then the steps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, Jake was already up, stoking the fire. I didn't mention the footsteps. I didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe it was just my imagination, or some animal that sounded heavier than it was. We spent the day hiking, exploring. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, almost enough to make me forget the night before. Almost. That evening, we sat by the fire again. The beer flowed, and we laughed, telling old stories. The unease from the night before started to fade. Then, right as the last bit of light disappeared, I noticed something. It wasn't obvious at first, but as the fire crackled, casting flickering light around us, I saw it. Small details that didn't belong. Branches were broken near our tents. Not the kind of break that happens naturally, but snapped clean, deliberate. And then the strangest thing, rocks. Small, smooth stones arranged in a line near the fire pit. I hadn't seen them before. I would have noticed. A cold feeling settled in my gut. Jake saw my expression and raised an eyebrow. "You good?" I forced a nod. "Yeah, just tired." I didn't sleep much that night either. Sometime past midnight, I woke up again. My body knew before my brain did. That feeling, that deep, primal instinct that something wasn't right. The air felt thick, charged. Then the noise. Not footsteps this time, but breathing. Right outside my tent. Low, steady breathing. I couldn't move. I just lay there, frozen, listening. The breathing was close, so close I could almost feel it. And then, the worst part, it wasn't just outside my tent. It was at Jake's too. A long pause. Then the breathing shifted. Steps. Slow, calculated steps moving away into the woods. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I was out of that tent fast. Jake was already up, pale, tense. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he had heard it too. We packed up. Neither of us talked about it. Not directly. We just moved fast. The fire was out, gear loaded. By the time we were in the truck, I felt like I could breathe again. We drove in silence for a long time, the trees passing in a blur. Finally, Jake spoke. "That wasn't an animal." I nodded. No, neither of us said what we were really thinking, because we didn't need to. Someone had been out there with us, watching, waiting, and they had been close. I never liked camping much, but I went anyway. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, just me and a few nights in the woods to clear my head. Life had been wearing me down, and I thought maybe some time alone, away from everything, would help. The plan was simple. Drive out to a quiet, isolated area, set up camp, spend a couple of nights, and head home. Nothing complicated, nothing risky, just peace and quiet. I picked a spot deep in the forest, far from any main trails. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The drive was long, about 3 hours from home, and the last stretch was nothing but dirt roads that twisted through thick trees. My phone had lost service miles back, but that was expected. I wasn't planning on using it anyway. I had a map, a compass, plenty of supplies, and I knew how to take care of myself. I wasn't some inexperienced hiker walking into the woods blind. I reached the site in the late afternoon, just as the sun started dipping behind the trees. It was a beautiful spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines with a narrow stream running nearby. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees and the occasional chirp of birds. I parked my truck at the edge of the clearing, unloaded my gear, and set up camp. Tent, firewood, food supply, it didn't take long. By the time the sun had fully set, I had a fire going and was sitting in my chair, staring into the flames. That first night was uneventful. I cooked some food, listened to the sounds of the forest, and eventually crawled into my tent to sleep. It took me a while to drift off. I'm a light sleeper, and every little rustle outside made me alert. But eventually, I did. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. Something had snapped a branch outside my tent. I lay still, listening. There were more sounds, footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of an animal, but something slower, heavier. Human footsteps. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe another camper? But I had gone out of my way to be in a remote area. The chances of someone else stumbling upon my camp were almost zero. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a bit, shining it outside. Nothing. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and beyond that, only darkness. I waited, holding my breath, straining my ears. The forest was silent again. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe a branch fell on its own, and my half-asleep brain turned it into footsteps. I stayed awake for a while longer, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and stretched, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. The air was crisp, and the forest looked harmless in the daylight. I walked around my campsite, checking for any signs of someone else being there. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, just the quiet woods. I told myself I had just been on edge and brushed it off. I spent most of the day hiking. The forest was dense, but I followed my map and compass, keeping track of my route. I didn't see a single person all day, which reassured me that no one else was around. It was exactly what I had wanted, solitude. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was starting to set again. I gathered more firewood, cooked dinner, and sat by the fire as darkness settled in. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. I woke up to the sound of slow, deliberate steps moving around my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife and sat up, heart pounding. I listened, waiting for another sound, but the steps had stopped. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the flashlight out, sweeping the beam across the area. Nothing. Again, nothing. The fire had burned low, just like the night before, casting faint orange light over the clearing. I stepped out, my breath visible in the cool air, and did a full circle around my camp. No one was there. No movement. No sound. Just the forest, still and quiet. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every time I started drifting off, I thought I heard something. Small noises, a twig snapping, something shifting in the distance. When dawn finally came, I felt exhausted. Something was wrong. I wasn't alone out here, even if I couldn't prove it. I decided to pack up. I wasn't going to spend another night out here. I loaded my gear back into my truck, making sure I left nothing behind. Just as I was about to climb into the driver's seat, I noticed something. Footprints. Bare footprints. They were faint, but they were there, just beyond the edge of my camp. Too large to be an animal. Too human. They led from the trees to the area near my tent and then back into the woods. I got into my truck, started the engine, and didn't look back. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. Every shadow between the trees made me uneasy. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step onto the road behind me. I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know if they were watching me the whole time or just passing through. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed another night. I don't think I want to know. The first day of the trip was perfect. The sun was just starting to set as I pulled into the small, secluded campsite tucked away in a quiet corner of the national park. It was my first time camping alone in years, and I wanted to reconnect with nature, leave behind the chaos of city life. The air was fresh, the kind of air that felt good to breathe deep into your lungs. I had planned everything carefully. The right gear, food for a few days, a tent, and my backpack filled with essentials. No distractions, no noise, just peace. I had driven past the park's ranger station and received a permit. They told me the site was remote, and I liked the sound of that. No crowds, no one around for miles. The idea of being truly alone in the woods was oddly comforting. I didn't tell anyone where exactly I was going, just that I was going camping. The stars would be my only company. After setting up camp, I unpacked my gear and made a small fire. The crackling of the flames and the smell of burning would fill the air. I didn't have much to do, so I sat there by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of insects, and the occasional call of birds still settling in for the night. It was all so peaceful, so perfect. I felt at ease. As the night fell, the temperature dropped. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, and the fire seemed to burn brighter against the growing cold. I pulled out my book and read for a while, the light from the flames dancing off the pages. The world outside the circle of light seemed like it didn't exist, a vast, empty wilderness stretching out for miles in every direction. It wasn't until the wind picked up that I felt a shift. The trees started swaying more violently, and the fire flickered in response. The sound of the wind grew louder, whipping through the branches. I put the book down and stood up, listening. It wasn't the wind that bothered me, though. It was the way the silence returned when the wind stopped. A strange kind of stillness that felt almost unnatural. My instincts told me to be alert, but I couldn't see anything, and there was nothing to hear except the faint crackle of the fire. I shrugged it off as paranoia and decided to settle down for bed. I didn't want to let my mind wander too far. I slid into my sleeping bag inside the tent and tried to relax, but every creak of the trees, every snap of a twig in the distance, made me jump. I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of being alone out here. It was probably nothing, just animals moving about, but my mind kept racing. The night seemed to stretch on forever. I kept my flashlight close by, my eyes flicking to the small light in the corner of the tent as if it would offer some kind of protection. I kept hearing noises that I couldn't identify, subtle rustling in the underbrush, faint movements just beyond the reach of my vision. I thought about the stories I had read of animals like bears or coyotes, and I was half tempted to leave the tent and check the perimeter, but I decided against it. I wasn't sure if it was fear of the unknown or just exhaustion, but sleep eventually overcame me. The next morning, the sun was already high in the sky when I woke up, casting long shadows through the tent. I stretched and rubbed my eyes, feeling the stiffness from sleeping on the ground. It had rained lightly overnight, and the ground was still damp. The air smelled fresh, almost like it had been washed clean. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent. The campsite looked much different in daylight. The trees towered over me like silent giants, and the ground was soft with moss and leaves. A thin layer of mist still clung to the underbrush, giving everything a ghostly feel. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it too. The birds were quiet, and the usual sounds of nature seemed muted. Maybe it was just me still waking up, I thought. I made breakfast over the fire and took my time. There was no rush. I was alone, and there was nowhere else I needed to be. I decided to go for a short hike to explore the area, leaving the campsite behind. The path was overgrown but clear enough to follow. I had a map with me and had marked a few landmarks where I could explore further. The ground was soft underfoot, and the trees formed a thick canopy overhead, blocking out much of the sunlight. I walked for a while, lost in my own thoughts, the cool morning air invigorating me. But soon, the trail became less distinct, and the undergrowth began to thicken. My feet crunched on dried leaves as I pushed my way through the brush, trying to keep my bearings. It was easy to lose yourself in the forest, and I had been warned about the risks of wandering too far. I had a compass with me, and I could always turn back if I needed to. But the further I walked, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, just the rustle of my own footsteps. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often than I liked, the sensation of being watched creeping up on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that I wasn't alone. But when I looked around, all I saw were trees and undergrowth. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, wiping the sweat from my brow. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping in the distance, faint but distinct. I froze, my heart racing. I stood there, waiting, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, a deer or something, and that I had nothing to worry about. But there it was again, closer this time. A loud snap, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I wasn't alone. Panic surged through me, and my mind raced through all the possible explanations. Person? A hunter? No, the park rangers would have noticed anyone else. And the footsteps were too slow, too heavy to be a person. It sounded like an animal, but not one I knew. My breath hitched as I turned around, eyes scanning the trees behind me. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to get back to camp, but something told me not to. The forest was thick here, and there were no clear paths back. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I stepped off the trail and crouched down, trying to make myself as small as possible. My instincts told me to stay hidden. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. I strained my ears for any sound, but the footsteps had stopped. Everything was silent again. I waited, terrified, trying not to make a sound. Eventually, I stood up, slowly, and backed away, taking care not to make any noise. My legs were shaky, and my breathing felt too loud. I didn't run, though. I kept my pace steady, moving back toward the trail. Finally, I spotted the trail again and began walking faster, eyes darting around. As I approached my campsite, relief washed over me. The fire pit was still there, the tent still standing. I was safe, but something was wrong. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, and when I entered the tent to check my things, I found that my pack had been moved. My flashlight was no longer where I left it, and the zipper to my food bag was undone. I was certain I hadn't touched them since I left. A wave of dread washed over me, and I knew then that I wasn't alone out here. I hadn't imagined the footsteps or the sounds in the woods. Someone or something had been watching me. I didn't waste time packing up. I gathered everything quickly and carefully, not wanting to leave any trace behind. I didn't care about finishing the hike or getting more pictures. I needed to get out. As I left the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The forest around me seemed alive with unseen eyes. It was a slow, careful walk back to my car, and every snap of a twig made my heart race. When I finally saw the parking lot ahead, I almost ran toward it, and the moment I reached my car, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I started the engine and didn't stop until I was miles away from that campsite. I didn't look back. I didn't go back to that park again. It started as an ordinary camping trip, just a weekend getaway to get away from everything. The noise, the stress, the daily grind. I hadn't done something like this in years, and the idea of spending a couple of nights out in the woods sounded like the perfect escape. I needed some time alone to think, clear my head, and reconnect with nature. I was tired of being in the city all the time, always surrounded by people and concrete. Nature seemed like the answer. I found a quiet spot at a state park a couple of hours away from home. I had been there once as a kid with my parents, but the place had always stuck with me. There was something about the dense forest, the tall trees, and the quiet sounds of the woods that I could never forget. It was the kind of place where you could get lost in the moment, where everything felt far away from the hustle of the world. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The air was crisp, the smell of pine filling my lungs as I unloaded my gear from the car. I had packed light, a small tent, a sleeping bag, some food and water. I didn't want to complicate things. This wasn't going to be some extravagant camping trip, just a few nights under the stars to unwind. Setting up my tent was easy enough. The ground was soft, and the trees offered a perfect spot of shade. I built a small fire, making sure to keep it under control, just enough to ward off the growing chill in the air. The crackling of the wood felt comforting, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the forest floor. There were a few other campers around, but they were all tucked away in their tents by now. The forest felt empty, peaceful. As the night wore on, I ate a simple meal of canned chili and sipped some hot tea by the fire. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant bird calls were calming. I thought about how good it felt to be disconnected from everything. No phone, no emails, no obligations. Just me and the wilderness. But as the night deepened, the peacefulness started to shift. The forest, which had once felt comforting, began to feel different. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint at first, just an odd feeling in my gut, like something wasn't quite right. The fire crackled and popped, and the shadows in the trees seemed to stretch farther than they should. I tried to shake off the feeling. After all, I was just imagining things. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, right? The woods were peaceful, just like they always had been. Yet, despite my best efforts to ignore the growing unease, my senses were on high alert. I kept glancing around the darkened trees, half expecting to see something lurking just beyond the light of the fire. And then I heard it. First, it was faint, a rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be a random animal. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise continued, slow, deliberate steps crunching on dry leaves and twigs. It wasn't just one animal. It sounded like there were multiple steps, coming closer. I froze. I'd heard animals in the woods before, deer, squirrels, raccoons, but this felt different, too coordinated, too purposeful. I stood up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the trees. My eyes darted around the clearing, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The rustling grew louder, closer. My heartbeat quickened, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I was alone, completely alone. The other campers were on the other side of the site, far enough away that I couldn't just call out to them for help. And anyway, who would believe me if I told them there was something out there? The sound stopped for a moment, and for a brief second, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something dark shifted among the trees. I froze again, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It wasn't an animal. I knew that much. It was too tall, too human. The figure moved with unnerving grace, stepping between the trees like it knew exactly where it was going. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of it, tall and thin, moving silently in the dark. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My first instinct was to grab my stuff and run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't move. The figure seemed to pause, as if sensing my fear. The forest around me felt still, unnaturally so. No wind, no rustling leaves, just that oppressive silence. broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. I stood there, watching. The figure moved again, slowly, almost like it was testing my reaction. Then it stopped and vanished into the trees. I didn't move for a long time, just staring at the spot where it had been. Minutes passed, maybe even hours. Couldn't be sure. The only thing I was aware of was the silence, and the gnawing feeling in my gut that told me something was very wrong. Finally, I snapped out of my trance and scrambled for my flashlight. I turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I aimed it at the trees where I'd seen the figure, but there was nothing there. The forest was still, too still. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. I didn't know what to do. Should I stay by the fire, hoping whatever it was would just leave me alone? Or should I pack up and leave the campsite, drive back into town in the middle of the night? I chose the latter. My hands were shaking as I quickly doused the fire, packing up my things as fast as I could manage. The noise of my own movements was deafening in the silence, the sound of the zipper on my tent and the rattle of the gear echoing through the woods. Every time I heard a twig snap, I froze, expecting that dark figure to emerge from the trees again. But nothing came. It felt like I had been packing for hours, though I knew it had only been a few minutes. I wasn't even sure what I was doing anymore. I just needed to get out. I grabbed my stuff and made my way to the car. The path to the parking lot seemed longer than I remembered, the trees looming overhead like dark sentinels. My flashlight flickered, casting long, jittery shadows. I kept my eyes on the trail, trying not to look back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I reached the car, my hands fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock it. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. I finally got the door open and threw my stuff inside, slamming it shut behind me. As I got into the driver's seat and started the engine, I looked at the dark forest one last time. Nothing moved. I drove out of the park, not looking back. The drive was a blur, just me, the road, and the sound of my own breathing. By the time I reached the highway, I was shaking so badly that I had to pull over to collect myself. I never went back to that park. Couldn't. Every time I thought about it, I could feel that same unease creeping up on me again. I don't know what it was I saw that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, the product of too much isolation and too much time spent in the dark. Or maybe, just maybe, there's something out there in the woods, something we're not meant to understand. Started out as a normal camping trip, or so I thought. I had been hiking through the woods with nothing more than the weight of my backpack, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel trail, and the occasional bird chirp filling the otherwise quiet air. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the trees, but it was still light enough to see clearly. I had decided to go on this trip alone. It was something I needed to do, to clear my head, get away from the noise of daily life. There was a small lake up ahead, the place where I had planned to camp for the night. I had read a few online reviews about it, and it sounded peaceful, secluded, just what I was looking for. The trail was empty when I reached the lake around dusk. I could see the water glimmering under the fading light, still and serene. Perfect. I started setting up my tent, taking my time to make sure everything was in order. The area around the lake was quiet, save for the distant rustling of trees and the occasional splash of fish jumping in the water. Felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I was getting the campfire ready when I noticed something odd. It was hard to describe at first, just a feeling of unease creeping up my spine. I had that odd sensation that someone or something was watching me. I scanned the trees around me, but nothing was out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling lingered. It wasn't the normal fear you get when you're alone in the woods. It was more like someone had been here before me, watching me set up. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just my nerves. It wasn't like I was new to camping. I had done this plenty of times before, but there was something different about tonight. Once the fire was going, I sat by it, staring into the flames, trying to push the uneasy feeling to the back of my mind. I unpacked some snacks and settled in for a quiet evening. The smell of pine trees filled the air, and the night noises of the forest began to come alive. crickets chirping, owls hooting, and the distant howls of wolves echoing in the distance. It all sounded normal, but that feeling of being watched never quite went away. Night had fully settled in, and the darkness seemed to wrap itself tightly around the clearing. I sat there for hours, thinking, letting the crackling fire keep me warm. Eventually, I decided to crawl into my tent and get some rest. It had been a long day of hiking, and I was exhausted. But sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept racing, replaying the strange sensation I had earlier, the feeling that someone was out there in the trees, just beyond the light of the fire. It was unsettling. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. It was faint at first, just a twig snapping, a rustle in the brush. But then it happened again, and again. Footsteps. Not the kind of footsteps you'd expect from an animal, but the kind you'd hear from someone walking carefully, deliberately. My heart started racing. The footsteps were slow, almost as if someone was trying to avoid detection, but they weren't very good at it. I could hear them distinctly in the silence of the night. I lay still, trying to listen more carefully, but the only sound was the pounding of my heart in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight from the side of the tent and quietly unzipped the flap, sticking my head out just a little. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the trees and the lake's edge. Nothing. I let out a breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was an animal or the wind. I didn't know. The woods can be strange sometimes. But then the footsteps came again. This time they were closer. I could hear them on the other side of my tent, almost as if someone was walking around it. My throat tightened, and I held my breath, praying I was imagining it. But the sound continued, slow and steady. I wasn't about to open the tent and check it out. Whoever or whatever was out there was close. Too close. I pulled the zipper shut quietly and sat there in the dark, heart hammering in my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal or some other camper, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The footsteps stopped for a moment, but the rustling of leaves continued. I tried to keep my thoughts calm, but they were running wild. I had no idea what to do. I could pack up and leave in the middle of the night, but that would make me look weak. Besides, I didn't want to give in to the fear that had taken over. The thing outside could just be another hiker, maybe someone else out here alone like me. But then came the whisper. It was so soft that I almost didn't catch it at first. A voice, low and raspy, barely audible over the wind. It was just a sound, nothing distinct enough for me to understand. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. Someone or something was speaking just outside my tent. I was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. I listened as the whispering continued for what felt like an eternity. Then it stopped suddenly. Dead silence. For a few moments, I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then, a sharp crack of a twig echoed through the woods, louder than any of the previous sounds. The footsteps returned, but now they were fast, rushing towards me. I had no choice. I grabbed my backpack, slipped out of my tent, and began running. I didn't even know where I was going at first. My mind was racing, my legs moving on instinct. The trees whipped past me, their branches scratching at my skin, but I didn't stop. I ran for what felt like forever, not caring where I went, just desperate to get away from whatever was out there. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my breath and the thudding of my heart. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing. I stopped, gasping for air, my legs burning with exhaustion. My mind was spinning, and my body was on the verge of collapse, but I had to keep moving. I couldn't go back to my camp. I found a large boulder and climbed up onto it, hoping it would offer me some protection. From there, I could see the trail in the distance where I had come from. The firelight from my campsite was now just a tiny flicker in the distance. Everything was so quiet now. The footsteps, the whispering, everything had stopped. I stayed there for hours, watching the trees and listening for any sign that something was coming after me. But nothing came. Eventually, the moon began to rise higher in the sky, casting a silver glow over the clearing. It was at that moment that I realized something. Whatever was out there, whatever had been following me, wasn't just some random person or an animal. It had been deliberate. The next morning, I packed up my things quickly, hardly looking around as I did. I wanted to leave as fast as I could. I didn't even take the time to break down the camp properly. As I walked back to the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. But there was nothing, no one was there. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I figured it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew deep down that I would never forget that night in the woods. The feeling of being watched, the whispering voice, the footsteps that followed me. I don't know what it was. I still don't. But I never went camping alone again. It was supposed to be the perfect camping trip. Just me and a few friends, far away from the noise of the city. We had everything packed. Tents, sleeping bags, food, and a stack of firewood for the nights. The place we chose was deep in the forest, about a 5-hour drive from home. It was one of those places you'd find on a map and wonder why anyone would go there. No cell service, no roads, just trails and thick trees. The first thing I noticed as we pulled up was the silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that felt unnatural. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, nothing. It was as though the forest had swallowed every sound. We shrugged it off at first. After all, it was a remote area. I remember saying something like, "It'll be fine," and everyone laughed nervously. We hiked about a mile into the woods, through dense undergrowth and tall trees, to a clearing near a small creek. It wasn't far, but the trail felt like it went on forever. The air was thick with humidity, and the forest floor was soft underfoot. As we set up camp, I remember noticing how still everything was, how it felt like no animals had been through here in a long time. The silence pressed down on me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We set up 2 tents, one for me and my closest friend, Chris, and the other for the others. The fire pit was just a few feet from the creek, and we piled logs around it, striking flint and steel to get a fire going. Once the flames took hold, the crackling of the wood filled the air, breaking the eerie silence. But even then, there was something off. The fire was bright, but the shadows around us seemed deeper than they should have been, stretching longer than normal. I couldn't explain it. We spent the rest of the afternoon cooking, talking, and roasting marshmallows, but I couldn't relax. There was this strange, gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. I kept checking the tree line, half expecting to see eyes watching us, but every time I looked, I saw nothing. It was a normal night, at least by our standards. Yet, the longer we stayed, the more I felt like the forest was closing in on us. When night fell, we all retreated into the tents. I lay in the dark, listening to the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of nature, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I thought I was drifting off, I'd hear something, an almost imperceptible sound in the distance. It was like a twig snapping or leaves rustling, but faint enough to be dismissed as nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something unseen in the dark. At one point, I heard Chris stir in his tent next to mine. He was awake too. I could feel the unease in the air, but we both remained silent, not wanting to acknowledge it. It wasn't until the sound came again, a loud crunching of leaves, something heavy moving around the clearing, that I finally spoke up. "I heard that too," Chris whispered from his tent, his voice tight with concern. We both sat up, listening intently. The noise was coming from the edge of the camp, just beyond the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't a squirrel or a deer. This was something bigger, something deliberate. My heart raced as I strained to hear more. The sounds grew louder, closer now. The crunching of leaves, the snapping of twigs, whoever or whatever was out there. It was moving through the forest with a slow, methodical pace. Not trying to hide, but not rushing either. Then suddenly the sound stopped. The air felt thick with tension. I could feel my pulse in my throat, every sense on high alert. It felt like everything in the forest was waiting for something to happen. I glanced over at Chris' tent, where I could see his outline sitting still. He was as freaked out as I was. The fire had died down a little, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and shift in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight from the corner of my tent and slowly unzipped the flap, stepping out into the night. The cold air hit me immediately, and I had to fight the instinct to run back into the safety of the tent. I shined the light around the clearing, the beam sweeping over the campsite, the trees, and the dark path that led deeper into the forest. Nothing. I took a cautious step forward, scanning the trees again. The light flickered for a moment before casting a long beam of white light over the path leading to the creek. That's when I saw it. A large, dark shape stood by the water, just at the edge of the trees. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and it was still as stone, watching us. My breath caught in my chest, and I couldn't move. It was human-shaped, but it didn't look right. Too broad, too tall, like it didn't belong. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, staring at it, until it slowly shifted back into the shadows, disappearing into the forest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I wanted to call out to the others, but I couldn't form the words. The only sound I could hear now was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Before I could even think of what to do next, I heard movement again. This time it was much closer, just outside the edge of the campsite. Something was circling us. I darted back to my tent, heart hammering, and zipped it up behind me. I could hear the others in the second tent rustling, probably trying to figure out what was going on. But I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. Every instinct told me to stay quiet, to stay hidden. I felt like if I spoke or moved, it would hear me, and then who knows what would happen. The rest of the night passed in a blur of tense silence. I don't know when I eventually fell asleep, but I must have. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping in the morning, the usual sounds of the forest coming back to life. But the night felt like it had taken something from me, like I had crossed a line I couldn't go back from. As we packed up and prepared to leave, no one spoke about what had happened. We didn't need to. We all knew what we'd felt, what we'd heard. There was no need for words. We didn't even make it a point to check the area around the camp for signs of anything strange. We just wanted to leave. The walk back to the car was quick, almost hurried. We didn't look back at the campsite, didn't talk about it. We didn't even make jokes like we usually did. When we got to the car, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder once more at the forest. It stood silent and dark, hiding whatever secrets it had. As I sat in the back seat of the car, heading back to civilization, I realized one thing. Whatever was out there, whatever we had heard, it wasn't something that could be explained away. It wasn't a bear or some lost hiker. It was something that didn't belong, something we should have never disturbed. And I knew, deep down, that the forest had no intention of letting us forget. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a few days away from the noise of everyday life. No emails, no deadlines, just me, a tent, and the woods. I had rented a small cabin in the middle of a state park, miles away from any town. I didn't even bother to tell anyone exactly where I was going. It wasn't that I didn't want company, but rather that I didn't want anyone to interrupt the solitude I craved. It had been a stressful few months, and I just needed to clear my head. I decided camping alone would be the perfect way to do that. No distractions, just me and nature. The drive there was long but peaceful. The roads wound through thick forests, and there was barely any traffic. When I arrived, the parking lot was almost empty. Only one other car was there, a beat-up old truck, its bed filled with camping gear. The guy who owned it was nowhere to be seen. The silence was almost eerie, but that was exactly what I wanted. I made my way to the cabin, a small wooden structure nestled between towering trees. It had a rustic charm, with a stone chimney and an overgrown porch. Inside, it was cozy, with a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen, and just enough space for one person. I unpacked my things, set up the camping stove outside, and started a fire. As the flames crackled, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. That evening, I sat outside, watching the sunset. The colors in the sky were breathtaking. rich reds and purples blending into the soft orange of the fading day. The air was cool, but not cold. Felt like the perfect evening. After a simple dinner of canned chili and crackers, I decided to take a walk along the trail that ran through the woods. I had read about it in the brochure, and it promised a quiet, scenic route that looped around the lake. The thought of walking by the water alone was oddly comforting. I grabbed my flashlight and set off down the trail, the soft crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound. The woods around me felt alive with noise, crickets chirping, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl. It was exactly what I had hoped for, but there was something off about it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the absence of other people, the lack of voices or footsteps besides my own. It felt like I was the only one alive in the whole park. As I walked, the trail began to climb slightly, leading me into denser woods. The trees were packed together so tightly that the light from my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. It was getting harder to see, and I started to feel a twinge of unease. I stopped for a moment to listen. There was no sound. The usual chorus of crickets and birds had stopped. Even the wind seemed to have gone quiet. It could have just been a coincidence. Maybe an animal had moved off into the distance, or the wind had died down. But the stillness made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. There was nothing to be afraid of. I was just being paranoid. I had camped plenty of times before, and nothing had ever happened. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the better of me. But as I continued walking, the feeling of being watched crept up again. My footsteps seemed louder now, and the darkness felt oppressive. I told myself it was nothing, but my nerves were starting to fray. I picked up the pace, eager to finish the loop and get back to the cabin. The trail started to wind around the edge of the lake, and I could hear the faint sound of water lapping against the shore. That's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a figure in the distance, standing by the water. I squinted, trying to make it out, but the figure was too far away. I wasn't sure if it was a person or just a trick of the light. Maybe it was another hiker. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day, but it wasn't impossible. I called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. For a second, I considered going closer, but something told me not to. The last thing I wanted was to get close to someone who might not even want to be bothered. I didn't need to know their story, and I didn't want mine to intersect with theirs. I turned around and started heading back to the cabin, a little faster this time. But as I retraced my steps, I noticed something else. Footprints. Not far behind me, there were fresh tracks in the dirt, as if someone had been following me. The prints were deep, like they were made by heavy boots. The trail was narrow, and it seemed impossible that anyone could have passed me without me noticing. But there they were, unmistakable, heading in the same direction I had just come from. I stopped, heart racing. The logical part of my brain told me it was just some other camper who had gotten a late start, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The footprints didn't look like they belonged to someone who had been walking casually. They were purposeful, like whoever was following me was moving with intent. I picked up my pace, almost running now, trying not to look back. The air around me felt heavy, as if something unseen was pressing in on me from all sides. The woods seemed darker now, even though the moon had risen, casting a pale glow through the trees. My breathing was shallow, and every snap of a twig or rustle in the leaves made me jump. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help myself. For a split second, I thought I saw movement just beyond the reach of my flashlight. My pulse quickened, and I broke into a full sprint. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, gasping for air, heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced. Who was out there? Why had they been following me? The stillness of the woods outside felt unnatural now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake it off. I was just overreacting, I told myself. Maybe it was just another hiker, maybe a ranger, or someone who had taken a wrong turn on the trail. But deep down, I knew something was off. It was too quiet, too still. I made sure the windows were locked and set a chair against the door for extra security. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening for any sound, any sign of movement outside. But there was nothing. The night passed slowly, each minute stretching on forever. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, but it was fitful, filled with strange dreams that I couldn't remember. When I woke up, the sun was already up, casting soft light through the cracks in the blinds. I was exhausted but relieved to see that daylight had returned. I told myself I had nothing to be afraid of anymore. It was morning, and the woods were as peaceful as ever. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't taking any chances. I didn't care how peaceful the morning was. Whatever had happened last night, whatever had been following me, was enough. I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I threw everything into my car, started the engine, and didn't look back. On my way out, I passed the same parking lot where I had arrived the day before. The truck was still there, but there was no sign of the person who had been camping in it. I didn't feel any sense of relief, though. Whoever had been out there, whoever had been following me, was still out there. And I was glad I was leaving before they could make their next move. The road out of the park was long, and the trees closed in on either side, casting shadows that made me uneasy. But I kept driving, not looking back once. By the time I reached the main highway, I was finally able to breathe easy. I never went back to that park again, and I never really told anyone what happened. I'm not sure what I saw out there or who or what had been following me, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never camp alone in a place like that again. It started with a weekend getaway, something to escape the hustle of city life, a break from the noise, the constant hum of traffic, the ringing of phones. Just a simple camping trip in the woods. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, knowing that I would be able to disconnect for a while. No emails, no meetings, no deadlines. The perfect chance to breathe. But that weekend would end up becoming something I would never forget. It was just me, my tent, and a small camping stove. Nothing fancy, no fancy gear. I had planned to go solo, hoping to enjoy some peace and quiet. My campsite was tucked deep into the woods, far from any marked trails. I didn't mind. Getting away from the usual path felt right. I'd been camping before, but this was different. I wanted to be in the heart of the forest, to get as far away from people as I could. I remember the drive there, the winding road through the hills, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional glimpse of a distant house. The forest started to look darker the deeper I went, the trees thickening into a canopy, the light filtering through only in small patches. I'd heard stories about these woods. Nothing supernatural, just the usual warnings about getting lost or encountering wild animals. But those were things you could handle, right? Nothing to really worry about. I found a spot by a small stream, clear water running over smooth rocks, the sound of it soothing. I set up my tent quickly, not wanting to waste the daylight. As the sun dipped lower, I got a small fire going. The warmth from the flames was comforting, especially as the air started to cool. The forest was alive with sounds. The rustling of leaves, birds calling out in the distance, the occasional snap of a twig. I sat back, watching the fire dance, and let myself unwind. But then, as the light completely faded, something shifted. The sounds of the forest became more distinct, like they were closing in. It wasn't anything particular, just the feeling that the forest had become more alive around me. I couldn't help but feel like something was off. It was like I was being watched, not in a supernatural way, just an uncomfortable awareness. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the forest's natural quietude settling over me like a thick blanket. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was easy to do, alone in the dark, surrounded by nothing but trees and shadows. So, I focused on the fire, feeding it small logs to keep it going, the crackling and popping sounds filling the silence. The night stretched on, and I started to feel more at ease. The anxiety melted away, replaced by the calm of being alone in nature. My eyes grew heavy, and despite the unsettling feeling from earlier, I decided to turn in. I zipped myself into my tent, the warmth of the fire still reaching through the thin fabric. I could hear the forest outside, but inside my little cocoon, I felt safe. The silence of the night outside seemed deep, almost thick. It wasn't peaceful anymore, it was oppressive. But I fell asleep anyway, my body too tired to stay awake. I don't know when I woke up, but something was wrong. My eyes opened to darkness. Not the usual dark of night, but an empty, suffocating kind of dark. It wasn't just the absence of light. It felt like the air had changed. I lay still for a moment, trying to understand what was going on. The fire had long since burned out. It was dead silent outside. No sound of the stream, no rustling of leaves, nothing. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Nature doesn't go quiet like that. There's always something. A breeze, an animal, even the distant chirp of an insect. But now it was absolute silence. I lay there, trying to listen, but the quiet was deafening. And then I heard it, a soft rustling, not too far from my tent, but too close for comfort. It was a sound I couldn't place. Not like the usual sounds of animals scavenging or moving through the woods. This was different. It was deliberate, slow, almost like someone was walking through the forest, careful, trying not to make noise but failing. I froze. My heart started to race. I couldn't even breathe at first, as if the air had been sucked out of my lungs. The rustling grew louder, closer. I wanted to call out, but my voice was trapped in my throat. What was it? Was it a person? A bear? No, person wouldn't be so quiet. But what else could it be? I waited, barely daring to move. The sound came again, closer. Something was definitely outside, moving toward me. I could feel my body start to shake, my mind racing through possible explanations, none of them comforting. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. I thought maybe whatever it was had gone away. Maybe I was just imagining it all. Maybe it was some animal that had just passed through. I let out a quiet breath, telling myself I was overreacting. But then I heard it again, closer. This time it was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate step on a twig, the crack of it underfoot. Someone was definitely out there. I knew it. I had no choice but to get out of the tent. My mind told me to stay hidden, to remain still and silent. But instinct took over. I had to know what was out there. I slowly unzipped the tent, trying not to make a sound. The cold air rushed in as I poked my head out, eyes searching the darkness. Nothing. The forest was still. The air was thick and heavy, but there was no movement, no rustling, no sound at all. I waited for a few more minutes, straining my ears. Maybe it was just an animal, maybe it had been my imagination. But then, as I stood there, staring into the shadows, I heard it again. A soft footstep. I whipped around, scanning every corner of the campsite. My heart was pounding, my mind racing through options. There was no way it was just a bird or a raccoon. I had to do something. My survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed my flashlight, clicking it on, and pointed it toward the source of the sound. There, just beyond the reach of the light, was a shadow, a figure. I froze, the beam of light cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing but a patch of empty forest. My breath caught in my throat. Had I imagined it? Or was something really out there, standing just out of sight? I had to move. I wasn't sure what was out there, but I didn't want to find out. I grabbed my bag, my flashlight still trembling in my hand. I zipped up the tent as quickly as I could, then grabbed the small stove, putting it into my bag. I didn't want to run. Running would draw attention, make me a target. So I walked quickly, keeping to the shadows, staying low. The entire forest felt like it was watching me, like every twig and leaf held some unseen threat. I moved silently, trying not to make any sound. I thought about the nearest road, how I could make it there if I just kept walking. I couldn't stay out there in the woods, not after hearing those footsteps. The shadows seemed to close in around me, and I kept moving, the chill of the night creeping into my bones. As I walked, my thoughts were a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be there, just out of sight. But each time I turned, There was nothing. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, I started to see signs of civilization. Distant lights in the distance, the low hum of cars on the highway. The relief that flooded through me almost made me collapse, but I kept walking. I wasn't going to stop until I was far away from the woods. By the time I reached the road, I was exhausted. My legs ached. My body was numb, but I couldn't stop. I flagged down a passing car, and the driver pulled over, concerned but willing to help. I didn't explain much. I just told him to take me to the nearest town. I didn't go back to that campsite. I didn't look back at the woods, even when I got far enough away to feel safe. I don't know what it was, whether it was a person, a bear, or something else entirely. But the feeling that I wasn't alone out there stuck with me. I don't camp alone anymore. I haven't been back to the woods since that night. The memory of those footsteps, the silence, the shadows, they still haunt me. I'll never forget the fear I felt. The fear that I wasn't just alone in the woods that night. And now, whenever I pass by a forest, I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. I never thought camping in the mountains would turn into anything more than a peaceful retreat, just a chance to escape the noise of city life. I thought it would be all fresh air, tall trees, and the sound of nothing but the wind whispering through the branches. But that was before everything changed, before I realized how fragile the boundary between calm and chaos really is. It was a Friday when I packed up my gear, excited for a weekend in the wilderness. I'd planned this trip for months, a solo getaway into the Appalachian Mountains. I had all the supplies I'd need: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, food, a flashlight, a knife, and a first aid kit. Nothing too fancy, just enough to keep me safe. I didn't need anyone else. The whole idea of camping alone was part of the appeal. The quiet, the solitude, no one to interrupt my thoughts, just me and the forest. I drove up through the winding mountain roads, the kind where every turn reveals a new view of the rolling hills, the deep green trees stretching endlessly in every direction. It wasn't until I hit the gravel road that I felt that familiar calm take over me. My phone barely had service, and I felt lighter with each mile I put between myself and the world. By the time I reached the campsite, it was late afternoon. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The campground was empty, which didn't surprise me. I had researched the area thoroughly. Most people avoided the more remote sites, especially this time of year when the weather was unpredictable. Perfect, I thought. I could set up my tent without worrying about anyone else. The area was beautiful, surrounded by thick trees and a small creek that trickled through the clearing. I found a flat spot and began setting up my tent, enjoying the process. It felt good to be away from everything. The sound of the creek, the rustle of leaves in the wind, it was all soothing. I thought to myself, this is what life is all about. I finished setting up the tent just as the last bit of sunlight began to slip away. The sky turned a deep purple, and the first stars began to blink into existence. I built a small fire with dry wood I had gathered from around the site, the flames crackling and dancing in the cool night air. The warmth was a relief, especially as the temperature dropped rapidly. I unpacked my gear, cooked a simple meal, and ate while watching the flames flicker. It was perfect. But then, as the night deepened, something shifted. At first, I couldn't place it. It was subtle. A slight chill in the air, a shift in the wind that made the trees groan just a little too much. I shrugged it off. It was just my imagination, I told myself. After all, I was alone, and my mind had a tendency to play tricks on me when I was in unfamiliar places. I finished my meal and settled back against the side of the fire pit, staring into the flames. It was quiet, too quiet. The creek's soft gurgle was still there, but beyond that, nothing. No rustling of animals in the underbrush, no distant sounds of birds settling for the night, just silence. I leaned forward and poked the fire a bit, adding a couple of small logs. The flames hissed and crackled as they consumed the wood, and for a moment, I felt a sense of comfort again. But then, as I leaned back, something caught my attention. a shadow moving just outside the edge of the firelight. It was too big to be an animal. It didn't move like an animal either. It shifted across the edge of the camp, too deliberate, too purposeful. I sat still, heart pounding in my chest. My first thought was that I was being paranoid. It was probably a deer or a raccoon, or maybe the wind pushing a branch. But the longer I watched, the more certain I became that it was something else. It didn't fit with the natural flow of the forest. I waited, my eyes locked on the shadow. It didn't move again. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. After all, what could it be? I was in the middle of nowhere. Nobody was supposed to be here. I reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. I swept it across the edge of the camp, the light shaking slightly in my hand. The shadow was gone. I exhaled sharply, feeling both foolish and relieved. But then came the sound, a low, soft scrape. It was faint but distinct, like something heavy dragging along the ground. My breath hitched. That wasn't normal. That wasn't a sound the forest made. Not like that. I stood slowly, my heart racing. The fire crackled, but its warmth no longer comforted me. It felt like a tiny island in the middle of an encroaching darkness. I grabbed my knife from where it lay beside me and held it tightly in my hand. I stood still, listening. The scraping sound came again, closer this time. It was coming from the other side of the campsite. I crept toward the edge of the camp, careful not to make a sound. My footsteps were muffled by the soft earth beneath me, but my pulse was so loud in my ears I was sure I could hear it from miles away. I got closer to the source of the sound, inching forward until I could almost feel the ground vibrating beneath me. I could see the outline of a figure now, just beyond the trees, moving slowly and methodically. It was large, maybe human-sized, but the way it moved, it didn't seem right. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like it was dragging something behind it. I froze, trying to steady my breath. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot. The other part of me kept telling myself it was just a wild animal, maybe a bear. But I knew better. Bears don't drag things across the ground like that. And whatever it was no longer in the forest's rhythm. The figure stopped, just outside my line of sight. I didn't move, barely breathing. And then the scraping stopped too. There was an eerie silence, like everything in the forest had paused. Even the wind had stopped blowing. I waited, my body tense, every muscle screaming to bolt. And then, in the distance, I heard it. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping in half. I whipped around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night. There was nothing there, just trees, and the shadows. But the air felt different now, heavier. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something was watching me. I needed to leave. I grabbed my pack and threw it over my shoulder, grabbing my flashlight and knife as I went. The fire was still burning brightly, but I couldn't stay there anymore. The fear gnawed at me, sinking deep into my bones. I wasn't sure what was out there, but I had no intention of finding out. I started back toward the trail, moving quickly, my mind racing. The camp was behind me now, but the fear didn't leave. I kept hearing the sound of footsteps behind me, the rustle of leaves, but when I turned, there was nothing there, just the dark woods stretching endlessly in all directions. By the time I reached the edge of the trail, the sun was starting to rise. It wasn't much of a relief. The day felt wrong, too. The trees seemed too still, the air too heavy. I didn't look back, not once, as I made my way down the mountain. I didn't stop until I reached my car, parked safely in the lot at the base of the trail. As I sat in the driver's seat, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my shaking hands. I drove away as fast as I could, never looking back at the mountain. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what it was that watched me from the shadows. But I do know one thing for sure. Whatever it was real, and I was lucky to get out of there.